And who are we talking about today? We're talking about a guy that I've wanted to do an episode on him for a long time. Who are we talking about today?
We're talking about Carl Philipp Fürst zu Schwarzenberg. He's one of the few, really, that's in a command position all the way through the wars, right from the Turkish Wars, through the Revolutionary Wars, right through to 1815.
And he was the overall commander during the defeat of Napoleon in 1814.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I were talking before we jumped on the call. He almost strikes me as an Eisenhower type character because he doesn't get the notoriety of Wellington or Blucher, but he was just as important in the defeat of Napoleon. Why do you think he doesn't get the publicity as some of the other generals?
He's very much the model for Eisenhower in terms of having to manage the politicians in a coalition who may have conflicting priorities, as well as managing the army.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he gets overlooked. I mean, it's partly because he died quite soon after. He died in 1820.
Right.
So he wasn't able to write a memoir or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think there was a certain amount, perhaps, of a feeling that he hadn't finished the job, and that when Napoleon came back for the 100 Days, and so the Waterloo rather overshadows everything else. Of course, once you get into the 20th century, the Germanic and Russian contributions to the wars tend to get a little bit pushed aside. And so he's been unfairly forgotten about, despite leading a much larger army to defeat Napoleon at Leipzig and chasing him back to Paris.
Yeah. He did have a major victory at Leipzig. He also had a major loss at Dresden, and he also served under Napoleon for a little bit. So there's a lot of facets to this guy that I'm looking forward to jumping into. Let's go right ahead and talk about his early life. He was born in April 1771 to Johann and Marie Eleanor. What do we know about his childhood?
Well, the Schwarzenberg family are what they call magnates. They're the really top nobles. They had owned a lot of land in Bohemia, which is now the Western Czech Republic, and parts of Hungary and southeastern Austria. And they had a very close relationship with the ruling Habsburgs. They were one of these big families that the Habsburgs relied upon. So he was brought up with a fairly typical education to prepare himself to serve the monarch. And
this is the Austrian Empire. Yeah,
the emperor. So it's a mixture of things to build up his sort of physical strength and military abilities, as well as academic subjects. French, maths, history, classics, religion, all these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And his main tutor was a guy called Franz Josef von Hasslinger, who would later be a senior official to Emperor Joseph II. And there was another chap called Meyer from Vienna University who taught him philosophical subjects, and then Bauer, who taught him mathematics. But on the military side, he particularly excelled as a horseman, and he was a good shot as well. So that, and also, of course, when you go to all these dues at court and all the rest of it, so he had to learn sort of dancing and fencing and all the sort of things that aristocrats went in for.
Yeah, and I read that he had health problems throughout his life, but when he was younger, he kind of built up his strength so he could serve in the military, which is particularly grueling on your body.
Oh yes, yeah. Nobody's very clear about exactly what it was, but he seems to have had a generally weak constitution, and he would be plagued by illness. So he did feel the strains of campaigning, but he was strong enough for the campaigns, but it rather took its toll on him more than on others.
Yeah, and he works his way into entering the Austrian Royal Cavalry in 1788. So he's only about 17 at this time.
Yes, he initially he went to the Theresian Military Academy. Or the Theresian Military Academy in Wiener Neustadt, which is just near Vienna, and he graduated from there in 1788, age 17, as you say, and he purchased an Unterleutnant's commission at the start of the Turkish War with Infantry Regiment 10, and was where he displayed great decisiveness and great bravery. It's not But his main thing really was leading small unit raids against Turkish positions. And as a result of his exploits, he was promoted then to lieutenant. He had a certain reputation for doing things his way, rather than in accordance with his orders. And he was certainly one of those commanders who was interested in the glory of his exploits, perhaps rather more than thinking hard about his own position. But he was then again promoted to captain or Hauptmann
Mhm.
following the storming of a fortress called Sabach, which is near Belgrade. At that point, he was kind of given the choice of where he wanted to go next, and he opted to join the army headquarters where Joseph II was actually there as well. So he got to know the emperor quite well. And then he's on the staff of Loudon, who was the actual army commander, who reported that he displayed great courage, good tactical eye, great activity, notably in the storming of Belgrade.
Mhm. And he's decorated for bravery, like you said, eventually become a major. So it sounds like he's rising up pretty quick. I mean, let's caveat that he is an aristocrat, so I'd say it's a bit easier for him to rise up through the
Oh,
army.
certainly, yes. I mean, he was, as you say, he was promoted to major in 1790, and he led some ceremonial cavalry at the coronation of Leopold II as Holy Roman Emperor. But yeah, these privileges are coming through, but he's now starting to suffer some of these illnesses, and he's having to be periodically discharged, and he's going back to his estates from time to time.
Around this time, 1789, 90, the French Revolution occurs, and then we have the French Revolutionary Wars afterwards. How is Schwarzenberg and Austria involved?
Well, initially, it's the Declaration of Pillnitz there in 1791 between Austria, or the Holy Roman Empire, and Prussia, telling the French not to harm their king.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to have upset the French even more.
Right. Yeah, that didn't work, that declaration. Yeah.
No, not at all. But they went in for, so the Allies invaded France, or tried to invade France, to protect the king and sort of restore order. And Schwarzenberg had been appointed to the La Tour Dragoons, which is it was a unit that was raised in the Austrian Netherlands, which is now Belgium. But
it's an elite unit, right?
It was an elite unit for its service in the 7 Years' War, and he got a pretty cold reception from the other officers precisely because they thought he'd only got the job because of who he was, and of course he's only 20 at that stage.
Yeah, and it's kind of a double-edged sword because you get promoted easier, but you almost have to prove yourself twice as more that you're actually capable.
Yeah, I mean, initially, when the fighting began in the Austrian Netherlands, he didn't get many opportunities to prove his skills, although he did lead a successful attack on the outer defences of Philippeville. And he's very much his particular skill is sort of small actions.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't. He was. I think he was quietly kind of pushed out of the La Tour Dragoons, and he transferred to a new unit, the Ulan Freiwillige, which are volunteer Ulans from Galicia. And at that point, he suffered a fall from his horse, to which many ascribed some of his later problems. But he led the Ulans at the big Austrian victory at Neerwinden on the 18th of March in 1793.
Over the French, yeah.
Over the French, and repelled Dampierre's attack on Onnaing on the 1st of May. But again, he's with the Ulans. They're light cavalry. They're engaged in raids, reconnaissance in force against the French. Mm-hmm. So once again, he's really coming to the fore as an advanced guard commander.
But nothing, I mean, other than his bravery, nothing so far that says he can command a giant army, 15 years later of 230,000 men.
Oh no, I mean he's only 22 at this stage,
Right.
but it was very much the thing for staff officers and potential future commanders that many of them were drawn from officers who led advance guards, raids, reconnaissance in forces, that sort of thing. So he's kind of in the right type of fighting, if you like.
Yeah, and he's learning along the way, so
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah. Well, in 1800, he serves under Archduke John at the huge Battle of Hohenlinden.
Mm-hmm.
The French are commanded by General Moreau, who's one of their best, and future marshals Ney and Grouchy. And it was a bitter loss for the Austrians, but Schwarzenberg performed well holding the right wing together. It was kind of a brutal battle.
It was quite a brutal battle. I mean, the war had only just recently resumed.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
The Austrians are out about 20 kilometers or so to the east of Munich, and there's a big wooded. It's very heavily wooded all around that area, and there's only one road that actually goes through to Munich, and the rest of them are just like they're just like tracks. I mean, even if you go there today, they are paved, but they're very narrow. They're sort of cycling tracks now. But and of course, with it being winter by then, it was very difficult for the army to march through. But they had a multi-pronged advance in 4 columns. He was with the northern column under Kienmeyer, where he was leading 15 battalions and a couple of the heavier cavalry regiments. At the head of Kienmeyer's column, and Kienmeyer divided his advance guard into 2 parts. And Schwarzenberg had the more southerly one, and he pushed southwest to tackle the French left with the divisions of Bastoul and Ney, famously, who were sort of about 1.5 kilometers north of Hohenlinden. So he's leading the assault on the main Austrian assault on the French left. With the next column down was making the main attack along the road, and he seized a place called Forstern, but Moreau then threw in Dalpool's reserve cavalry. So there's a lot of backwards and forwards amongst the villages, and he managed to seize some of these villages, and then he'd lose them again. But as the Austrian the French in the south made a sweeping movement that actually got between the 3rd and 4th Austrian columns, and then they got round behind the second column just to the south of Kienmeyer. That basically broke the whole Austrian army up when they crushed that column.
Yeah,
it was on the main road.
But I was reading though that it would have been more of a rout if Schwarzenberg didn't hold the right wing together.
Yeah, what he did initially as the French began their counterattack in the north, his force was virtually surrounded, and a French officer came out with a white flag to demand his surrender, and he told him to go away politely, and cut his way out and led his men out. And as his force was still in reasonably good order, he was able to form enough units from Kienmeyer's column to form a rear guard to protect the rest of the Austrian army, which had basically just broken up.
Got it. Okay. Well, together with Napoleon's victory at Marengo, Napoleon secures his throne in 1800. Peace is declared shortly afterwards, and Schwarzenberg gets married around this time to Marie Anne von Hohenfeld, with whom he has 3 sons. What do we know about his personal life?
He actually married her in Vienna, January 1799, just before the campaign. But he came back from the campaign, and again, things had kind of taken their toll on him a little bit. He retired to his estates in Bohemia, and that with his wife, and they had 3 sons there, born in 1800, 1802, and 1803.
Right.
And
I think it's important to note that the Schwarzenberg lineage is still active to this day.
Oh yes, yeah. Karl Schwarzenberg, who is he's part of the main line from Karl's brother Joseph. He was the Czech foreign minister for a couple of periods there around 2010.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1804, the title was kind of split, so that Joseph Schwarzenberg is the first von Schwarzenberg, i.e. he's got the main title, but Carl Philipp was made the first zu Schwarzenberg. It means it makes his family a cadet branch, so they still have a title. Otherwise, the title of first or hereditary prince would only go with the main line. So he's got this sort of secondary title.
Okay.
And but unfortunately his main lands are around a place called Orlik in southern Bohemia, and unfortunately his castle burnt down in 1802.
Oh no!
So he threw himself into repairing it and putting it all back together, and managing his estates. And he was a very keen reader. He read a lot of books, studies of military campaigns, politics. Took an interest in botany of the plants and trees on the estates, and his wife was very well educated as well. So he enjoyed a pretty happy domestic life there, really. And he was able to recuperate from having fought through all the previous campaigns. He'd been in Germany in 1796 and 1799 under Charles.
Yeah,
so he'd been fighting all the way through.
Yeah, and after some much deserved downtime, in 1805, Austria is back at war with Napoleon, and Schwarzenberg serves under the unfortunate General Mack, who eventually surrenders his entire army to Napoleon at Ulm. But Schwarzenberg is not among the ones who surrender. Do we know how he escaped from the trap?
Yes, it's one of these very political things. Mack was an appointment of the politicians in Vienna. But nominally the commander-in-chief was Archduke Ferdinand d'Este. It's a sort of associated family of the Habsburgs. And Mack had been inserted as the chief of staff, and there was a lot of arguing amongst the senior commanders, as Mack was kind of convinced that everything was going to be okay. And Schwarzenberg fought at Günzburg on the 9th and Uningen on the 11th of October, but Mack failed to break out of Ulm, and it was becoming quite obvious that he was going to surround the fortress. And so on the 17th, which is the day before the fortress surrendered, Ferdinand d'Este announced he was going to break out with the available 12 squadrons of cavalry, about 1,800 men, and Schwarzenberg as well, and they broke out. They were pursued by Murat, and there was a whole there's bad weather, lack of supplies, and almost daily clashes with French cavalry, but they managed to get back to Bohemia.
Yeah, the whole thing sounds like there was too many chefs in the kitchen in terms of the command structure there.
Yeah, it's a typical. It's a problem because the Austrian chiefs of staff were very powerful figures. They play a much greater operational role, but they were indirectly appointed by the politicians. So if the commanding generals, the military men, had different views from the politicians, it could lead to a lot of infighting, and it was a problem throughout the period, actually, for the Austrian army.
And after Austerlitz, Austria again sues for peace. So Schwarzenberg has a little bit of downtime, correct?
Yeah, he was an observer at Austerlitz, and he actually predicted disaster for the army if they engaged Napoleon. And that gave him a bit of kudos, of course, when it actually happened. But yes, again, he's back on his estates, and he was very ill there in August 1806. Although he then recovers again, again from the strains of campaigning.
Yeah, yeah, and it is. It's a hard life, even for the generals at the higher level. It's still tough. In 1809, again, Austria is back at it against Napoleon, and Schwarzenberg is again fighting against Napoleon, the epic Battle of Wagram, which is a closer battle than the Ulm debacle, but the Austrians still lose. However, Schwarzenberg performs well. He's promoted to general. He was not involved in Aspirin-Essling, though, correct? That was Archduke Charles.
Yeah, at the start of 1809, he'd been sent back to St. Petersburg as a special envoy. He was tasked with persuading the Tsar to remain neutral, or at least not get too involved in the upcoming war. The Tsar was initially fairly hostile, blaming Austria for any renewed war, but kind of by about April time, he shifted more to a position of agreeing to delay Russian involvement as much as his treaty obligations to Napoleon under the Treaty of Tilsit would allow. So Schwarzenberg had done a pretty good job with that. So he only left Russia at the end of April. So he rejoined the army on the 3rd of July, 2 days before Wagram.
Okay.
He commanded a division in the Reserve Corps under his childhood friend, Prince Johannes Liechtenstein.
Well, I think it's after the battle after Wagram's Znaim, they have peace yet again with France. And this time, after peace is declared, he serves as the Austrian ambassador in Paris. So he had some training in this field. How did he do?
He did very well. He as I said, he did well with the Tsar, kind of moving him away from complete support for Napoleon. And of course, he'd had the diplomatic upbringing, the training, and he'd moved in the right circles to be a skilled diplomat. It obviously requires skills somewhat different from commanding an army. And so he went to Paris at the end of November to arrange the marriage of Napoleon to Franz's daughter, Maria Louisa. And he got on pretty well with Napoleon, but he did take the opportunity to sort of see where the supports for Napoleon's regime were. The sort of the political support, where he was getting his manpower and his money from, and all that sort of thing. He found out quite a lot about how the French were operating.
So he was spying a little bit while he was there.
Yeah, well, I think it's Metternich, isn't it, who said a diplomat is sent abroad to spy for his country.
Yeah, that sounds right. And I read something that he threw a party that actually resulted in a terrible fire.
Yes. The marriage took place on the 1st of July, 1810, and the same day he held a big party at the Austrian embassy. But unfortunately, a candle set a curtain alight, and there was a big fire in which 19 people were killed, including his own sister-in-law, Pauline.
Awful.
And she was so badly burned that he was shocked by what he saw, because they could only really sort of identify her from some of her clothing and her jewelry. She was that badly burned. And Napoleon apparently was really quite considerate to him because of the shock of seeing what had happened.
Yeah, and I know, like you said, Napoleon actually liked Schwarzenberg, found him to be a smart man. And in 1812, Schwarzenberg serves under Napoleon in the massive invasion of Russia. Schwarzenberg and his Austrian army protect, I think, the southern flank of Napoleon's main army.
Yes, he'd actually been in Paris to sign the Treaty of Paris, which formally made Austria an ally. And then at his request, after Archduke Charles had refused to command, Schwarzenberg was given command of the 30,000 strong Austrian Auxiliary Corps. And yes, they were protecting the right wing to the south there, sort of around Warsaw and Minsk, that kind of area. And Rainier had 13,000 Saxons, but they'd been struggling a bit, and so Napoleon gave command of Regnier's corps as well to Schwarzenberg, so he's got the whole right wing,
Right.
facing about 40,000 Russians under Tormasov.
And there were a few battles there.
Yes, the big one really was after he was heading from Warsaw towards Minsk, and he attacked Tormasov across some very marshy ground around a place called Gorodechno, I think, which is about 150 kilometers east of Warsaw on the 12th of August. But unfortunately, his attempt to envelop the Russians failed, and Tormasov managed to escape, knowing that more Austrian troops would be arriving. But it did have the effect that the southern flank was then secure, and Napoleon could head for Moscow. Although Schwarzenberg, it depends who you read. I mean, he pulled back westwards towards Warsaw because he thought that's what Napoleon was most concerned about. But Napoleon, he was kind of ambivalent. I mean, he did give Schwarzenberg a baton, which is now in the Austrian Army Museum in Vienna, and recommended his promotion to Felt Marshal. But apparently he wasn't too happy that Schwarzenberg had pulled back. There was kind of suggestions that this is the start of Austria being more kind of conciliatory towards the Russians and not pushing the point too much.
Yeah, and I remember towards the end of it, the Prussians made a separate peace with the Russians under MacDonald. So I think Napoleon was always worried that Schwarzenberg might try the same thing.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for him. He was in a difficult position because he felt as a military man it was his duty to serve his commander, Napoleon. But on the other hand, he had his political masters in Vienna,
right?
And he kind of went down a kind of middle way there and withdrew on the Austrian magazines. But that, in effect, he was then protecting the rear guard of Napoleon's army, and it probably made the Russians a little wary of pressing Napoleon's army,
right,
as they came after him.
Yeah.
So
it's an interesting middle line he would have to toe. Like, do you listen to your commander who's Napoleon, or do you listen to your home country of Austria? So he probably played it right, without upsetting either one. But
yes,
it's probably a difficult position.
Yes, it's a case of really kind of keeping people at a distance, but securing his magazines. And then he fell back and just kind of remained fairly inactive around a place called Pultusk. And then in 1813, he marched back into the Austrian part of Galicia and handed command over to Fremont.
Well, in 1813, 1814, on the Allied attack on Napoleon now, Schwarzenberg is eventually given the overall commander, appointed the overall commander of 230,000 men. How did he get this appointment? Because there was probably many generals who coveted this role.
Yeah, he had been back in Paris in April 1813, pressing Napoleon to seek peace whilst Austria was still officially neutral. So he was still on good terms, but he kind of gave up with that fairly early in the May. Many of the former commanders, Austrian commanders, and the Tsar wanted Archduke Charles to take command, but the court politicians they didn't want Charles there, and so they kind of whispered in the emperor's ear and reminded him of Wallenstein in the 30 Years' War, the overmighty subject, because they were pretty confident they were going to win this time, and they didn't want all the glory to go to Charles. And they persuaded the emperor to issue a general decree that none of the royal princes take any part in the war. So that pushed Charles out without sort of directly criticizing him. And it was on Metternich's advice that Schwarzenberg was appointed commander of the Austrian army, assembling in Bohemia in May. And they then also took on Radetzky as the Austrian chief of staff.
Well, while we're talking about this big Allied offensive, let's talk about the Trachenberg plan, which
yes,
was developed allegedly by Schwarzenberg and former French Marshal Bernadotte, who's now on the Allied side. What were the details of this plan?
Well, it's more of an evolutionary process rather than kind of one meeting.
Mm-hmm.
The Prussian chief of staff Scharnhorst was supposed to have been involved in it, but he was already dead by the time the Prussian and Russian monarchs met at Trachenberg in mid-July to agree the plan. Bernadotte and Jean Moreau, who'd gone over to the Allies from the French, advised not tackling Napoleon himself.
And to attack his marshals
to
instead.
attack the marshals, to weaken Napoleon, because of the danger, of course, if you engage Napoleon himself in a big set piece battle and Napoleon wins, obviously you run the risk of some of the nations will perhaps abandon any coalition, because they were all waiting to see what Austria was going to do, because Austria was still officially neutral at the time.
Yeah.
But the Allied, the Austrian chief of staff, Radetzky, and his planning staff in Vienna they kind of come up with the same kind of approach. Although this is more because of the Austrian political priorities of kind of just pushing Napoleon back, not absolutely destroying him as the Prussians and Russians wanted to do. But that kind of folded nicely into the Trachenberg plan. And that the plan, as it eventually came about, was there would be 3 armies, and they would only engage the marshals. If Napoleon came towards any of them, whoever it was would fall back. And the others would then attempt sort of to get across Napoleon's rear or his lines of communication, and then just generally force him back.
I think it's a clever plan because, with Napoleon, you usually had the Imperial Guard, and the French troops usually fought way harder under Napoleon. However, they somehow forget this plan and they lose terribly at Dresden. But at the same time, they defeat Oudinot and Ney outside of Berlin, and they beat MacDonald, I think, at the Kotzbach. So it does work a little bit.
Oh yes, I mean, well, Dresden was a classic case. Austria had joined the coalition in August, and Schwarzenberg wanted to hold off. He came out. He was in Bohemia again, and he was heading in towards Dresden, but he wanted, once he knew that Napoleon was actually in Dresden, he didn't really want to attack. But the Tsar and the Allied monarchs pressed him to do so, and of course he was defeated quite badly by Napoleon in very bad weather.
Didn't end well. Yeah.
But beyond that, yes, I mean, as Napoleon would initially, he tried to deal with Blucher, but when he went off that way, the Austrians would try and get round behind onto his communications. But over time, the Allies then start pressing in, and Napoleon did have another move against Blucher in the north. He had about 63,000 men. And Bernadotte was not far away with the army of the north. It's another 67,000. And they're in the north, facing the main army in late September. And Schwarzenberg then moves against Murat. So it's following the plan. As Blucher fell back, Schwarzenberg engaged Murat and pushed him back towards Leipzig.
Right. And now, since you brought up Leipzig, they kind of get away from the plan because that's where Napoleon is, and it's a giant 3-day battle. And Schwarzenberg does a fine job kind of directing the onslaught that really had so many different fronts and almost like tentacles to it. It's almost hard for any historian to wrap their heads around it, because it was like, just a massive battle. I think many tens of thousands of people died. How would you summarize this battle?
Well, it is the culmination. It was the point at which they finally decided that they were strong enough to defeat Napoleon, but it was going to be necessary to manage Blucher, Bernadotte, and Schwarzenberg, who had the main force coming in from the south. as well as Bennigsen, who was laying siege to Dresden at the time. He had another 40,000 men.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, Schwarzenberg is pushing Murat back on the 14th of October, and there's a big cavalry battle at Liebert-Volkwitz, 12,000 cavalry. Schwarzenberg himself led a cavalry countercharge at one point in that one. But Napoleon returned from the north with his troops to Leipzig, and he had at that point he was superior to Schwarzenberg, and so on the 16th he attacked the Austrian it was an Austro-Russian Prussian force under Schwarzenberg and pushed them south from Leipzig. But the advantage the Allies had, of course, is Blucher is coming in from the northwest, and the Allies knew that he was coming in that day, and so he will be able to pin down the French forces in the north under Ney.
Yeah,
and so Ney couldn't reinforce the Napoleon's attack, and so although Napoleon's attack, he had a Murat led a big another one of these big cavalry charges,
right?
And in the afternoon, it was quite successful. They almost got through to the Allied headquarters.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah,
but they basically ran out of troops because they were expecting the troops from Ney, but in the north, Blucher had actually routed Ney.
It was just a battle of attrition at this point.
Yes, it was the 17th. Both sides were pretty exhausted. Blucher continued to advance on Leipzig from the north, and Bennigsen's 40,000 Russians had arrived from Dresden, and Bernadotte was arriving from the northeast. So the whole thing is being managed in by Radetzky and the Allied staff.
Mm-hmm.
And they're bringing them in, and then on the 18th, essentially they close it into a ring right around sort of north, east, and south sides of Leipzig. They closed the ring about 2:00 and pushed the French back into Leipzig by about 5:00, and then it was all over. And of course, the French retreated during the night.
And there's only one bridge out of town.
Yeah, and they blew that one too early.
Yeah, so that's a disaster. But Schwarzenberg, as overall commander, I think gets the victory for that one. So good on him for putting it together.
Yes, yeah. So he was. I mean, he did have the largest force. He had his force was probably a little bit larger than Blucher and Bernadotte put together. And of course, the Allied monarchs were in his headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was his staff that were directing everybody in, and the next day he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Maria Theresa Order by Emperor Franz on the actual battlefield. Yeah, and then pressed for the invasion of France.
Yeah, which occurs in 1814. He leads the Allied army somewhat slowly, as critics might say, in towards Paris. But Napoleon abdicates in April 1814. So I guess overall, even though they had a few setbacks early on there, Schwarzenberg did okay.
Yes, it was the same kind of idea. Blucher was kind of to the north, and Schwarzenberg was to the south of the it's the Seine, I think. And although Napoleon, of course, had his famous 6-day campaign where he fairly smashed up the Prussians, that enabled Schwarzenberg then to. He goes for the communication, Napoleon's lines of communication, to take the pressure off Blucher. And he realized he was aware that Napoleon had got as far as Reims on the 14th of March. And there's a road sort of due south from Reims down to Troyes, which is about 60 kilometers to the south where Schwarzenberg was. And so Napoleon turned south, and there was a battle, fairly indecisive battle at Arcis-sur-Aube, which is the main one for Schwarzenberg, on the 20th, 21st of March. But then Napoleon made his mistake. He then he then headed east to try and cut the Allied communications, both Schwarzenberg and Blucher, but of course that left Paris open. And so Schwarzenberg defeated Mortier at Frères-Champenoise on the 25th of March, and by the 31st of March, they were in the Allies were all in Paris.
Yep, and it's pretty much all over, or is it? Because we all know that Napoleon comes back in 1815 during the 100 Days. What role does Schwarzenberg play here? I know he's not at Waterloo.
Well, he was. He was showered with decorations from the European countries.
Sure.
And he'd been made the president of the Hofkriegsrat, which was the Austrian sort of military administrative body. And he was kind of around the Congress of Vienna, and he did lead some of the opposition to Prussian demands to be given all of Saxony. He, again, the rigors of campaigning meant he spent most of his time back on his estates. But when Napoleon returned in May 1815, he worked out a plan. Again, it's a kind of a coalition plan, but they're probably more optimistic, I suppose, than the Trachenberg plan. He worked out a plan with Wellington, who was also at the Congress. And Schwarzenberg was appointed commander of the Austrian forces this time. And he divides his army in two, commanding the army of the Upper Rhine himself. And he led them through Western Germany into France, but there was no serious fighting for him. And he just entered Paris for the second time on the 17th of July. And he stayed there for a few months, but then went back to Vienna to resume his duties as president of the Hofkriegsrat.
Okay. And Napoleon again abdicates and is sent off to St. Helena. But Schwarzenberg, unfortunately, his health begins to really fail after 1815. What happens to him in 1817?
Well, in 1817, he suffered a stroke, which left him partially paralyzed, as often as you may know from people that suffer strokes. That's often what happens. And then 3 years later, he decided he'd go for a little trip around the old battlefields, and he'd visited Kulm and Dresden, but he was actually on the Leipzig battlefield on the 12th of October, pretty much on the anniversary. And at that point he suffered a second stroke, and he died 3 days later in Leipzig on the 15th of October, aged just 49.
Isn't that tragic? Like, I mean, the battle claimed its last victim, 7 years after it was fought.
Yes, it is quite remarkable what he got through, and yet he didn't even get to 50.
Yeah. And Tsar Alexander remarked on hearing his death, quote, "Europe has lost a hero, and I a friend, one that I would miss as long as I live," end quote. Yeah, you wonder if he was just walking around the battlefield thinking of all the friends he lost there, and it just overwhelmed him or something.
It's possible. I mean, of course, medical knowledge isn't what it is today, as he had quite a weak constitution. He'd had the fall from his horse,
right?
And so maybe there was some head damage there, perhaps something like that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about his legacy. I know we talked earlier that his princedom continues to this day. What is his legacy within the Napoleonic era? Because there's all these larger-than-life figures, but I think for whatever reason, Schwarzenberg doesn't get enough credit. What do you think his legacy is?
Well, I think it's kind of twofold. I mean, he's one of the very few that gets involved in both the political and the military side of things, and he's showed that it is possible to do both. Napoleon perhaps wasn't the greatest diplomat. Schwarzenberg was more skilled, but he's kind of the original archetypal coalition supreme commander, with the political leadership breathing down his neck in this case, because they were in his headquarters,
right?
Rather than for the likes of Eisenhower in World War II and Schwarzkopf in the First Gulf War, where they had the politicians on the phone. But these guys have had to follow Schwarzenberg in managing, and not just having to manage the army and and other related forces in coordinated attacks. I mean, he's got what was it, about 230,000 men?
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, yep.
At Leipzig, something like that. These are huge armies. When you consider that a lot of the revolutionary ones, sort of 30,000 aside, these are truly vast armies, and so there's army management. So he relied very much on his chief of staff, Radetzky, and his head of operations, a guy called Langenau, who was a Saxon who'd gone over to the Allies. And so it's created the beginnings of this modern position where the chief of staff is running the whole staff operation and leaving sort of the political side of things to the commander in chief. So he's very much the archetype for that.
I think he's craftier than people give him credit for, because like we were talking earlier, when he was in Russia, he had to figure out what the middle of the road was that he could toe. So in 1813, 1814, you're dealing with the Prussians who are just out for blood. They want to kill Napoleon.
They want to kill him, yeah.
Right. You're dealing with Bernadotte and his Swedes and Bernadotte probably wants the throne of France. You're dealing with the Russians and the British. It just must have been a lot for him he probably took all these points of view and then formed the plan from there. I just thought he was craftier than people give him credit for.
Yes. I mean, he did have the advantage of this aristocratic background, and he was kind of used to high level politics, but he had that advantage of being in a sort of ambassadorial position both in Paris and Russia. So he knew an awful lot about what was going on, and that, I think, made it easier for him to manage it. But in a way, Dresden had helped him because he'd been pushed into moving on Dresden against his own wishes by the Allied monarchs. It ended in defeat, and so that kind of leveraged his position and gave him more authority, so that the monarchs would listen to him rather more than they had done previously.
Yeah, and I do have seen that, some historians call him more cautious with his attacking, but like you pointed out at Austerlitz too, he knew that was a bad idea. So
I mean, it's his own experience of battle, particularly as a small unit commander. He has to assess the situation very quickly. This is why he got this kind of reputation for doing his own thing,
right,
rather than following his instructions.
Yeah,
but it did come in handy, and so he could do these assessments. But it also, of course, fitted in with dealing with the politicians, because Metternich wanted to get into this kind of balance of power situation for Austria. And so he didn't want to push the French too much, but of course he had to convince the monarchs of Prussia and Russia and elsewhere that he was pushing Napoleon.
Yeah, it's just it's quite a story, his overall biography, and I'm very glad you talked to us about it. Would like to point out, David Hollins has several books out on Amazon and in bookstores through Osprey and Pen and Sword Publishing, correct?
Yes. I've also a couple of years ago, I did a chapter in the Hellion compilation, which is called Glory is Fleeting. I think it's probably the first time the Battle of Second Caldiero in 1805, that was Archduke Charles against Massena in Italy.
Yeah,
it's the first time it's been fully written up. So if anyone's interested, you can find the detail in there. So it's about 12,000 words on it.
Perfect. Yeah, no, look into that. And we always love having Dave on the podcast, because he just talks about the Austrian point of view, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, it's well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a lot of work for you. I've seen all the podcasts all going through. You've got to organise people and organise the podcast and run the whole thing. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about these. As you say, with Schwarzenberg, he is rather forgotten about, and it is unfair, as had Napoleon just stayed in Elba or been sent off to St. Helena in 1814. Rather than 1815, then he would have been the big hero who defeated Napoleon.
You know what? That's a good point, because Wellington fairly or not, gets kind of that end credit for being the final defeat of Napoleon. But yeah, that's a fine point. Well, Dave, thanks so much for coming on the show. Again, please check out Dave's books anywhere books are found, and we hope to have him on again soon.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, John.